Growing up in the South, in a pretty religious family, folklore is always around. Being Mexican to boot, these stories were always a constant reminder to be a good child. My grandfather believed in this wholeheartedly. He loved telling us that if we didn't behave, El Cucuy was coming to get us. El Cucuy was the boogeyman, just like La Llorona was a woman who wept to lure children to the river to drown them, as she had done to her own children. How are these age-appropriate stories? My grandfather insisted that he saw La Lacrucia, a witch turned into a large white owl, roaming in the backyard once. I started to keep track of when he mentioned one of these names. If my cousins and I were too loud, El Cucuy was coming. If we ran around outside too much, La Lacrucia would take us away. In my grandfather's last few years of life, he never spoke of any of these ghastly creatures anymore. Albeit, we were older and less noisy around him, we would laugh as we'd recall him yelling at us. All the while, my grandfather remained silent. Because his health started to decline, he would speak in hushed whispers about things that scared him. What I remember most during his last years was that he was always afraid of the dark. He spent his nights pacing the house. He would call relatives at 3 or 4 a.m. to see what they were doing. Like clockwork, he would call my parents' house. 3 a.m. phone call, 4 a.m. phone call. One morning in the summer, he didn't call. He didn't call because he said he smelled something. The story he told my grandma is one that is hard to believe. He's walking around the house making his rounds, a slight shuffle in his house slippers over the tiled floor. St, 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 st. He never really picked up his feet. St, 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 st. He was moving from kitchen dining room area to the front living room. Sometimes when the street light is on, you could see the street from one side of the yard to the other. Cars lining the street in front of the house where people were sleeping. All but one person, or so he thought. He heard something he wasn't sure of. Was it talking or mumbling? Maybe it was humming. No one should be awake at this hour. My grandfather shuffled to the front door. That's when he saw her. A woman dressed in dark clothing walking down the middle of the street. Ever curious, my grandfather opened the door. He stood behind the screen door in silence as the wind picked up and he smelled it. In an instant, he smelled something foul, a wall of sulfur. And just like that, it was gone, leaving only lingering smell of roses. He didn't say anything, didn't move. Then she turned to him. An old woman, small in stature, with no real facial features he could recall. A darkness covering her face, although she was within the beam of the streetlight. She was wearing a black veil, lacy, framing her oval-shaped face. She looked right at him as she tried to get near, her feet shuffling towards the edge of his driveway. St, 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 st. Immobile with fear, my grandfather stood at the door. The smell of roses was growing stronger as she approached, her face beginning to compose features. Eyes, dark and set deep under her brow. Small, mute mouth, sunken cheeks that seemed to tug her face even more into an oval shape, too elongated to be real. As she approached the driveway, she stopped. The humming was back. Was she talking? Was she singing to him? My grandfather watched as she tried to step onto his property. She struggled. Something was preventing her from walking up the driveway. Seemingly forced to remain on the street, she stopped humming. Her face was that black hole. The eyes, were they glowing? Was the jaw that stretched far down into a snarl howl shape? The sulfur smell was back. She, this creature, was unable to cross over onto my grandfather's property, and with a screech, she moved back to the middle of the street. St, 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 st. This creature began its humming down the street, seeming to vanish in the darkness that went beyond where the light street could reach. This went on every early morning for several weeks. My grandfather never told a soul the first few nights. Who would believe him that he saw the devil in the street at 3 a.m.? The sulfur rose smell lingering in his nostrils so much that he began to overly use his nasal spray. He used these menthol inhalers once every month. After his visitor's appearance, he would use one a week until he was placed in the ICU on his deathbed. That holiday season, my aunt saw a woman walking down the street at night. When she went to the kitchen for water, she heard a song that she didn't understand with the smell of roses when she approached the door. The woman stood at the driveway and sulfur stained the air. My aunt was too afraid to get any closer to the door and went back to her bedroom. February of 2009, my grandfather laid with monitors hooked up to him, delirious from pain medication and his body deteriorating. He began to say he could smell roses, the devil's perfume. He would be adamant of the rosy sulfur smell in the air. That she went roaming the street, singing to people to take, sings to them to walk out of their homes. He said that the creature would come out of the walls at the foot of his bed in the ICU to visit. This is the first time my aunt heard of someone else speaking of the woman walking down the street, smelling the roses and sulfur. This is the first time something this far-fetched was ever uttered aloud within the family. Everything was always some folklore story, but this happened to two different family members. March of 2009, my grandfather passed away. I had to fly in thinking I wasn't able to say goodbye, but he held on for me. When I heard the story of the devil in disguise, I shrugged it off with a smirk. Oh, right, like that could have really happened. No, it's for real. I saw it. My aunt loved to exaggerate, but the look in her eyes made me skeptical. That night, I dreamt of the story as if I was there. I could smell the roses, the sulfur. I saw the small, frail woman walking the street under the street light. When she turned to me in my dream, her face was a black void. At my grandfather's funeral, the priest spoke of life and how in death we're reunited with our loved ones and are at peace. I couldn't shake that feeling of the dream. At the cemetery, by a crooked mesquite tree off in the distance, there was a woman, small in stature, skinny. Where were her feet? Was she looking at me? How? I couldn't see her face. It was broad daylight and I couldn't see her face. I smelled roses. The wind whipped up and it was warm, and briefly, I smelled it. I smelled the sulfur. There was nothing around but empty fields. Where was this sulfur smell coming from? I looked around, back at the tree, but she was gone. And was the smell? Every now and then, I hear a sound like shuffling feet. St, 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 st. And I smell roses. St, 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 st. If I close my eyes, I can see that small figure in black. St, 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 st. I open my eyes before she looks at me. St, 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 st. Is that the devil's perfume I smell?